Been here for 25 years. I don't remember when we started the Thursday morning. Okay, we were just discussing how long we've been doing these classes. They used to be at 8:15, right at when parents were dropping off kids from school. So welcome back to Thursday Morning Torah. And I want to just, before I get to the Torah portion, I want to say a word about the fact that it's Lag BaOmer today and what Lag BaOmer is. So the Omer, in theory, the Omer is two different things. It's both the traveling from the exodus from Egypt to Sinai, the 50 days that it took, and it is also the barley harvest. But it became in later years a period of sadness, and there are two possible explanations, at least two, for why it is. The traditional explanation is that a plague broke out among the students of Rabbi Akiba during the time of the Omer, and the plague ceased on the day of Lag BaOmer. The other explanation is that it was related to the revolt against Rome, and Rabbi Akiba was a supporter of the revolt against Rome, and of course that came to a very bad end. And both Rabbi Akiba and many, not both, but Rabbi Akiba and many other rabbis and disciples were killed, and perhaps the fighting stopped at Lag BaOmer, or there was a small victory then, we don't know. But for whatever reason, today is a day of celebration and is associated with the Yortzeit, with the anniversary of the death of Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, who is traditionally known as the author of the Zohar, the medieval book of mysticism. So in Israel, for years, they used to have bonfires on this day, but that has gone awry, as bonfires tend to do, so now, at least in theory, they are outlawed. Nonetheless, the bonfires were to show symbolically the fire of Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai's Torah, of his teaching, and so we still have that symbolic idea, even though we don't have the literal idea. And people who, for example, grow a sphira beard, who let their beard grow during the Omer, sphira is another word for the Omer, for the counting, they'll shave on Lag BaOmer. Weddings and other celebrations will happen on Lag BaOmer when they won't happen on other days of the Omer among certain groups. Some will only wait till after Lag BaOmer and then have celebrations, different traditions. But nonetheless, today is a joyful day, however you slice it, and I wanted to just make mention of that since the Torah class happens to fall on Lag BaOmer. But that isn't the subject of the actual study today. The subject of the actual study, we are going to find, let's start with chapter 25, verse 47 to set the context of it. So, if a resident alien, that is someone who's not part of the Jewish community but lives with you, has prospered, and your kinsman being in straits comes under his authority and gives himself over to the resident alien among you, or to an offshoot, he shall have the right of redemption even after he's given himself over. One of his kinsmen shall redeem him. In other words, you should make sure that he, given himself over, by the way, means what we would call indentured servitude. That is, you owe money, you don't have any money, so you have to work for somebody to pay off your debt. Or his uncle or his uncle's son shall redeem him, or anyone of his family who's his own flesh shall redeem him, or if he prospers, he can redeem himself. He'll compute his purchaser the total from the year he gave himself over until the Jubilee Year. The Jubilee Year is the redemption of all debts. The price of his sale is applied to the number of years. You'll see why I'm reading all this in a minute, as though it were termed for a hired laborer under the other's authority. If many years remain, he shall pay back for his redemption in proportion to his purchase price. This is all basically civil legislation. And if a few years remain until the Jubilee Year, he shall so compute, he'll make the payment to his redemption according to the years involved. He'll be under the authority as a laborer hired by the year. He shall not rule ruthlessly over him in your sight. And if he hasn't been redeemed in any of those ways, he and his children with him shall go free in the Jubilee Year. For it is to me that the Israelites are servants. They are my servants whom I freed from the land of Egypt, I, the Lord your God. Up to now, what we're talking about is, if you have the money, then you have to try to free somebody of the Israelite people who's in indentured servitude. And if you can't, then they go free in the Jubilee Year. Of course, the Jubilee Year happens every 50 years, so it's not the sabbatical, it's the Jubilee. But then what interests me is what comes next. You shall not make idols for yourselves, or set for yourselves carved images or pillars, or place figured stones in your land to worship upon, for I am the Lord your God. You shall keep my Sabbaths and venerate my sanctuaries, mine the Lord. Why does it, in the middle of all this civil legislation, suddenly talk about God? How God is your Lord, and also against idols. So one of the explanations that comes from the Sifra, from rabbinic literature, is that in pagan societies there were gods of commerce. Mercury, for example, was a god of commerce. And the idea of business life was in some way separate, as it still is for many people, from the idea of religious life. And there are still people in our own day, many people, who are very carefully observant in every way except when it comes to their business. And the separation between their economic life and their religious life is almost complete. And they believe in some weird way that God has something to do with everything except the way they conduct themselves in business. And I think that part of the idea of the juxtaposition here in the Torah is to remind us that none of the aspects of your life are supposed to be separate from your religious heritage. That is, from the centrality of God in your life, both in the way you conduct yourself in business and the way you conduct yourself in particularly religious settings. So even though you might not think that cheating on your taxes is a religious question, I think according to the Jewish tradition, cheating on your taxes is a religious question. Even though obviously the United States government is not a Jewish government, nonetheless, there is a principle in Judaism, dina de malchuta dina, that the law of the land is the law. That is, if you break the law of the land, then you are by proxy breaking Jewish law, because if it's a legitimate government, then it has a right to legislation. And so what you have here is this reminder that, especially in the Torah, which has so much legislation that's basically civil legislation, that there is no part of human life that is supposed to be separate from religious sway. And the marketplace is supposed to have God in it in the same way that the synagogue is supposed to have God in it. You don't leave God in the synagogue to go out and prosper in the market. That's a hard lesson for people to embrace, but if you think about it, a lot of Jewish ethics are business ethics. And a lot of the things that are permitted or forbidden in the Jewish tradition are essentially this civil legislation. So, as an example, there is the idea of what's called ona'at devarim, oppression of words. You're not supposed to go into a store, this would be very hard for people to observe today, and ask how much something costs if you don't intend to buy it. The reason you don't do that is because you then you lead the person, and remember, this arose in a time when everybody had their own shop. It was like going into the shuk in Israel. You lead the person to believe you're going to buy what it is you're negotiating about, and if you don't intend to buy it, then you've effectively deceived them, because why would you ask if you didn't intend to buy it? And so that's one of many, many, many examples of the field of business ethics, but I think if you ask what area of ethics are what area, not single thing, but what area of ethics are most commonly disregarded, business ethics, along with ethics of speech, are probably the two greatest ones. And this notion of religious life touching everything except what you really care about, which is your business, is sort of inverse of what's supposed to be, because the area that you care most about is exactly where Jewish law and Jewish tradition is supposed to have sway. I want to remind you that if you want to ask questions, you can ask questions online, and we will monitor those questions and try to answer them if possible. But that's also true of those of you who are actually here in person. If you want to ask any question, just let me know. So the other part of this is that you can assume that people were creating idols to help them with their business and worshiping them. And this impulse of, I think it's partly idolatry, but it's also good luck, the sort of superstition that leads people when they really care about something like a sporting event or an investment or something like else, that leads people to be superstitious. This also is a kind of deep human impulse, but at least in the Torah, of course, a religious impulse and a superstitious impulse are not identical, even though sometimes it feels that way. Okay, so what you have here in Bahar, and Bahar means, at the mountain, is that right at Sinai, because the beginning of Bahar is the Lord spoke to Moses at Mount Sinai, speak to the Israelite people and say to them, right at Mount Sinai, there are all these, that's 25:1 that I just quoted from. There are all these aspects of civil legislation about selling a house, buying a house, the Jubilee Year where there's redemption of debts, the land, what you can eat in the land, all of that kind of thing. And you may know, since it's Lag BaOmer, as I mentioned at the beginning, this is an insight into the rabbinic mind, the classical rabbinic mind. So one of the things that is part of the legislation is Orla, which is when you plant a tree, how many years do you wait before you can eat the fruit of the tree? Not 7 to eat the fruit of the tree. 7 is the sabbatical year, but you can eat the fruit of the tree after 3 years. And that's why, by the way, what else reminds you? What do you do after 3 years? Cut the hair, exactly, the same. This from the same idea. You cut hair after 3 years, and you can eat the fruit of the tree after 3 years. Now, Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, who, as I said, whose yortzeit is today, who traditionally died on Lag BaOmer. So Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai hid for many years in a cave from the Romans. Okay? Remember that he lived during the revolt. The revolt went south. He ran away and hid in a cave. So the rabbis ask, if he hid in a cave, how did he sustain himself? Right? There isn't a lot to eat in a cave, obviously. And their answer, one of their answers, is miraculously a carob tree grew up, a miraculous carob tree that grew up in the cave, and he ate from that carob tree and sustained himself. Now, first of all, I've had carob, buxer they call it. They used to give it out in yeshiva when I was a kid, and believe me, it wouldn't even sustain a great rabbi. But nonetheless, let's say that it would. Let's say that it would. The rabbis then asked the question, the rabbis of the later rabbis asked the question, how could it sustain him? Because for the first 3 years, he's not allowed to eat from the tree. Now, do you realize how many assumptions you have to make to get to that? First of all, you have to believe that he hid for more than a decade in a cave. Second, you have to believe that a tree miraculously came up. And third, you have to believe that if a tree miraculously came up, Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai would worry about the law of Orla in the cave hiding from the Romans. And I just think there's something, from one perspective it's funny, but from another perspective it's kind of beautiful that they actually carry the details of the law all the way into the clearly legendary idea that a miraculous tree grew up in the cave. The other part of this story, by the way, which is really interesting and does actually relate to this, is when he came out of the cave, he saw Israelites working, farming, carrying on their jobs, and he got so angry that fire came out of his eyes and consumed the cave and consumed the fields. And God said, if you have come out of the cave to destroy my world, go back into your cave, which is a parable about being too righteous in the world. That is, people have to live in the actual world. They can't be these paragons like Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, which is part of the reason, I think, why you don't actually have monasteries in the Jewish tradition. We don't have stories, there are many of them in the Christian tradition, but we don't have any stories of someone who went off to be alone in a cave for 30 years to commune with God because he was so holy. Even the one person who went off for many years was Rabbi Akiva, but he went off to study, not to be alone. And this idea of being a hermit and living by yourself, and that is an admirable thing, really doesn't exist in the Jewish tradition. And it's actually, it's not only that it doesn't exist, but you wouldn't be able to observe the mitzvot. You can't pray all the prayers alone, right? You can't eat the meals of Shabbat. You're supposed to have 3 meals on Shabbat, so you can't go on these prolonged fasts that a lot of these people went on. Like Gandhi, he'd have to eat on Shabbat if he was Jewish. The idea is like the fasting and praying that is very holy in other traditions and is considered a religious ideal does not exist in Judaism. All the great tzaddikim, all the great righteous people are considered great in community. That is, they still, in fact, the one example that I can think of someone who really isolated himself and was a remarkable and strange character was the Kotzker Rebbe, who lived the last 20 years of his life alone in his room. And they would give him meals under the door and so on, but he would still pray with the community. They would stand right outside the door, he would open the door a little bit or open a flap in the door. So he was still part of a community even though he was isolated. And that's one of the reasons why I think business ethics are so central to the Jewish tradition, because the tradition always sees a person as situated in a community as opposed to separate from the community. This is, I think, for us, like a paradigm of what it means to be a person. And in some ways, it is much easier to be righteous when you're alone. It's much harder to be righteous with other people because other people do things you don't like, right? That's what the nature of other people is. Everybody does that. And so you have to figure out how to be a decent person in a family, for example, because we also don't have the idea of celibacy as an ideal. There was one rabbi that we know of in the Talmud who was celibate. And he said he was married to the Torah. But the other rabbis don't approve of it. So he was like a one-off, and he's not held up as a great paradigm of holiness. All the others had families, and that means that they had to be parents, and they had to be partners, and they had to deal with all the things that people deal with. In fact, I was just listening. I only listened to the very beginning of it, but the beginning was interesting. I'm sure the rest will be, and I recommend it to you. I recommend it anyway. Barry Weiss's podcast, Honestly. The most recent one, many of them are wonderful. I don't want to say all of them are wonderful because I haven't listened to all of them, but the ones I've listened to are great. And the most recent one has 3 parenting experts on. And one of the parenting experts, when she had a 3-year-old, took her around the world to see how people parented in other cultures. Because her sense was all of our data and all of our conclusions about parenting are based on Western culture. So, yeah, you can compare how they parent in France to here, but it's not the same as comparing how they parent in Ghana to here. And what she found, unsurprisingly, she says, every time I came home, I would cry for days because in all these other cultures, there's so much support and so much help. And when you first come to the village, you don't know whose kid belongs to whom, because everybody is responsible for everyone. She said over time you discover, okay, this is this. But I just thought about that in terms of, like, ideally in the Jewish world, that is sort of how it's supposed to work. We're supposed to be Kol Yisrael Arevim Zeh Vazeh, all of Israel's responsible for one another. And so this idea of the sacred, isolated person, that we really don't have, not with parents, not with children, not with community. And in that sense, the individualism of American culture sort of pushes against the communalism that that Judaism promotes. It has both ideals in it, but the communalism that Judaism approaches or promotes, and we even saw that in the first thing that I read, which is if your kinsman is indentured to someone else, you have a responsibility to redeem them. Whereas, how often have you heard people say in families, so-and-so made bad business decisions, that's too bad, right? But here, if somebody's an indentured servant, they probably made bad business decisions in one way or another. You're responsible to make sure that they're okay. A very, very different ideal and a very different social structure. All right, let me stop there for questions, comments, something, please.
So why is Jewish law so...
Yes. So why is Jewish law so pervasive in every aspect of daily life? I think, though I don't know, I don't know enough about it to say for sure, the same thing's true in Islamic law. And I think that the reason it is so is both of them, unlike Christianity, set up a society. That is, Muhammad and Moses gave legislation in the desert. Jesus speaks in a society where Rome is already set up. So Jesus could have talked about civil law all day, but nobody was going to follow what he said because it was Roman law that decided everything. But if you set up a new society as Israel did in Israel, so then you say, well, what's the law about, if my ox gores your ox? And it's decided by the same people who set up all the laws. So it's all seamless. It's all one thing. And it does, if you read like classical Jewish law, really like the Shulchan Aruch, it governs everything, like which shoes you put on first in the morning. Everything, because the assumption was there's nothing that's absent from God's concern. And that's why the separation of church and state came to us through Christianity, because Christianity grew up in a state that was already established, that is Rome. But Judaism didn't. Judaism created a state and a religion sort of at the same time. In fact, there's a great book, a really fine book that written by John Levinson, called Sinai and Zion. And it's about the two traditions in Judaism. One, Sinai, which is the desert, the wilderness, the sort of the pristine religious experience. And the other is Zion. Moses is Sinai, David is Zion. Zion is how you set up a state, because Zion is obviously Israel. And both traditions exist in Judaism because they had to create both. But there are, he shows in the book, it's a pretty short book, but it's really full of insight. There are differences in the Sinai traditions and the Zion traditions for obvious reasons, because one of them is about being in the desert and the other one is about being in the land. This is what makes Israel and Israeli law so complicated. The one rabbi who really tried very hard to adjust Jewish law so that it could fit modern society. Obviously, you have to adjust Shabbos rules, because what are you going to not have the electricity grid? Is it going to go down on Shabbat? Things like that, really very practical stuff, was Herzog, the chief rabbi of Israel, who was a brilliant scholar. He was rabbi in Ireland first, came to Israel, and a book just came out that I considered ordering but didn't order because I thought it's going to be one more book that I'm going to want to read forever and probably won't. But about her, by Alexander Kay, Kaye, about, I don't remember what it's called, I just remember the author's name, about Herzog's like scheme for how Herzog tried to create Jewish law for the state. So I know he did, and I know that a book exists on it, but that's as far as I got.
So it seems to me it's still made that.
Well, there are allowances for judges to have discretion in certain things, and there's for a Beit Din and so on. But the assumption still is that the law covers everything. I mean, is there individual choice? Yeah, there's a lot of room in life for individual choice for what profession you do. Interpretations proliferate, and you can follow this interpretation or that interpretation. So, at least in the context of Jewish life, there's a lot of difference. And by the way, I was talking about this last night. I was teaching the conversion class, and I was talking about the different Hasidic groups, and how the Hasidim fought with the Mitnagdim. All through Jewish history, there were always fights with different groups. Always, always. I mean, look, King David's own kids rebel against him. So there's clearly never been unity. But the attempt to create L'taken olam b'malchut Shaddai, to sort of fix the world under God's kingdom, is a fairly constant attempt. Okay, so let me just go to the questions on the computer. One was, could you repeat the book title, please? Sinai and Zion by Jonathan Levinson was the book title. What does Ona'at Devarim, to what extent does it apply to comparison shopping? Sometimes one has to do that to make an informed decision. Well, what I would say is two things. First of all, and also Rose asked, what about the yeshivot where people study for a long time? One is comparison shopping is different in two ways. The person generally doesn't own the store. If they do, or they get a commission, then you have, according to Jewish law, an obligation to say, just want to know what the price is, because you don't want to mislead them into thinking you're going to buy. That would be the only way in modern parlance you would do that. And in yeshivot, where people study for a long time, they study with other people. They're still not alone. It's not like being in a monastery, and most of the people in yeshivot have wives, they have children, or they're going to have wives and going to have children, so that also makes it different. And then Debbie asked, how do we get to the point that we'll go back to the idea of community in America? Is it possible? I don't know. I think there are communities in America, and there have been many attempts throughout American history to set up the equivalent of like kibbutzim, but it hasn't been very successful. And the weird paradox of big cities is that big cities where lots and lots and lots of people collect together are very isolating, right? You would think that they would be, but they're not. They're the opposite. In some ways, small towns are much more community building than places that have 100 times as many people. So it is, I mean, who knows what will happen in the future? It's very uncertain. But I would say that a lot of social movements have backlashes later on. And it might be that the social movement towards isolation and individuality will have a backlash. The other thing is that one of the ways we get back to it is through religious institutions, which are supposed to create community. So I grant you that I don't want to say the pandemic is over. It's clearly not over, but a lot of its fearsomeness has been mitigated. So I guess it's time to come back to shul. All right, thank you very much, and hope to see you next Thursday morning. Hope to see you on Shabbat morning, and that was Thursday Morning Torah. Sure.